Charles Mountain from the RAA, thanks for speaking with us this morning on Flow, the morning after the federal budget.
Yes, well, it's good to be here.
The Truro Bypass was one project we talked about in the Augusta Highway just before the budget. Those figures are definitely there in the budget, but are we going to see those works happening in the next 12 months?
For those particular projects, we probably won't see a lot of activity. We know that the North-South Corridor, the what's known as the reference design, will be released towards the end of this year, and that will form the basis of probably the beginnings of some of the works. But realistically, given the size and scale of that project, it's not really surprising that we're not going to see big movement on that corridor for a little while yet. I think what we have seen from the budget, though, is obviously the confirmation of the funding, and a decision appears to have been made that they're going to start at the southern end and move from Darlington to Anzac Highway. So that part of the project seems to be reasonably well locked in. But in terms of when it's going to start, the timeline really hasn't changed from what was originally proposed.
Yeah, so Shadow Labor Treasurer Stephen Mulligan in South Australia has said they're concerned that there's not going to be enough jobs going on in the next 12 months during this pandemic recovery. It brings me to think about the local road funding that is in the federal budget. What did we learn there? I mean, that would seem to me councils and their roadwork machines could perhaps get out there fairly soon off the back of that funding.
Well, absolutely, and that's exactly what we would expect to see. I mean, we've already seen with the tranche of monies that have been released pre-budget, a lot of metropolitan road sealing works, for example, have taken place. We've seen a lot of shoulder sealing programs and regional programs being brought forward, and that work is currently in train. So there's no doubt having that funding available has meant that those projects that were ready to go have now kicked off, and we're starting to see the benefit of this across our network as well. So that's obviously really good. I think just on that point, the additional funding that's been allocated for duplication of further sections of the Augusta Highway is really welcome, and given the fact that the work on that has substantially begun, the opportunity for that is ultimately that project hopefully will be able to be rolled on. So we'll see a fairly smooth transition of additional works on that particular corridor.
So the National Farmers Federation in previous budgets, and they have mentioned it this morning as well, they say there's a $1.3 billion annual gap in regional infrastructure spending across the nation. Are there structural problems when it comes to regional infrastructure spending when it comes to budgets? Like you would say you would always like more, but is there something that needs to be structurally addressed so we get more infrastructure spending in regions?
Well, yes. I mean, the short answer is yes, there's always a need for more, and yes, we are coming off the back of an historic underspend in the regional road network. So the last couple of years we have seen some movement towards addressing this, and obviously that's extremely welcome. But yes, to your point about ensuring that there's a sustained structural means to allocate funding on a consistent basis is something that needs to be looked towards in future budgets to ensure that there is a sustained momentum across the network. So once we get from the position where we are at the moment to a position where the overall regional road network is to a better overall standard, then ensuring that we've got sufficient funding through the maintenance tranches, etc., is critical to ensure that then the network is maintained at the desirable standard.
Now, is there anything that was in the budget speech last night and the related documents that you weren't aware of, or that's come as a pleasant surprise or an ugly surprise after last night's budget speech?
Look, there's some good things. Some of them probably didn't people didn't hear a lot about, but obviously things such as black spot funding being maintained, I think is very important. That program continues to deliver very good outcomes across the network. There was Roads to Recovery funding has been provided for next year, so there's $45.1 million for that. And the financial assistance grants to councils as well has been increased to $45.7 million from to 22.4 in the 21-22 budget, so that's important, as is the supplementary roads funding, which is really important as well. But there were some good projects, smaller ones, which I think nonetheless are important. One is, for us, is the Greater Adelaide Freight Study Bypass, which is really important, and some works for Murray Bridge and the South East Planning Study. So that's an important area for funding to look at, getting better outcomes for the movement of freight through the back part of Adelaide. And another important one I should mention too is also $40 million for improving road safety outcomes on Kangaroo Island.
The South East Planning Study, that caught my eye looking through the budget documents as well. It's a fairly vague description. It's clearly about moving freight better through that region, but what has been mooted or suggested there about how we move freight better through the South East?
Look, there's probably a number of things being looked at from that. I mean, if we sort of look at starting at from the Truro bypass, we've got, obviously that's a really important outcome, and the next part of it will be looking at what can be done from the existing corridor that runs through the back from Murray Bridge, how that connects into the Dukes Highway. Possibly also there'll be some investigation about duplication of the Swanport Bridge as well in the longer term. Together with obviously looking at improvements for the other corridors down to the southeast as well, as and where necessary. So it's a big project, but obviously having this funding available to do a detailed planning study and then prioritise works is really important for our long-term future freight movement sustainability.
And when we're talking freight there and in that context, is rail on the table in those studies, or is it really about, well, we're going to have to move it by road?
Well, at this stage it looks like that's about road. I haven't seen anything much in terms of rail investment for this region in particular. That's where perhaps there might need to be some more focus going forward. The other one I will mention, I think is important too, there's been $170 million allocated to improve internet and mobile phone coverage across regional Australia, which again is a very important issue, particularly for tourism, but obviously for business and agriculture as well. So that's an ongoing piece of work that needs obviously to be addressed to ensure we don't have black spots, particularly on our critical infrastructure networks.
Yeah, well, Charles, thanks for summing that up for us. It's great to spot some of those things that might otherwise get missed in the budget, so I appreciate your time this morning with us.
Good, thanks very much for the opportunity to have a discussion, Ricky.